here, but I have one speaker who is actually a Ukrainian. Maksym Chepeliev is a research economist at Purdue University. He received his PhD in the National Academy of Science in Ukraine, and he's been working on the Ukrainian energy sector and the internal linkages between energy transition, emissions, and development. He's co-authored a paper on short-term pain for long-term gain on the cut of Russian oil fuel exports. Please.
Many thanks, and thanks for providing an opportunity to present our work here. And this is a joint paper with my colleagues from Purdue, with Tom Hertel and Dominic Mandermans-Brugge. Next, please. So what I will talk here is first like a bigger picture on impacts on EU in general, then we'll zoom in into some country-specific impacts and also distributional outcomes for the most impacted countries. And then we will also talk about long-term implications of this move. So we find some substantial environmental co-benefits from this possible restriction on imports. Then we'll also touch on potential impacts on the Russian economy, and then we'll conclude. So in terms of the importance of this step, the revenues from fossil fuel exports represent over 1/3 of Russia's total budget, and half of this amount is contributed by EU. So if these revenues were to be cut off, of course, this could have a tremendous impact on Russian economy and possibility of financing its military operations. US and UK have already announced the move of banning energy imports from Russia, though of course for them the stakes are much lower than for EU. For EU, the share of imports from Russia in total imports from all sources varies widely across fuels, so from around 22% for the case of natural gas and up to 36-37% for the cases of coal and petroleum products, and this is figure on the left. So when considering import dependency, it's important to take into account their domestic production volumes, and when we take that into account, the use import dependency on Russian fuels is, of course, lower. It does not exceed 28% for the case of crude oil, 9% for petroleum products. It's also important to point out that while it's hard to substitute natural gas, as previous speakers have already mentioned, in value terms, oil and petroleum products constitute 65% of total value flow. So focusing on those is also very important in terms of influencing their policy debate. The level of energy dependency also widely varies by countries. So across individual EU member states, mostly Eastern European and Baltic countries are at the top of the list. And this, of course, implies a heterogeneity of impacts across countries. Impacts of cutting Russian energy imports would also largely vary in terms of the time frame. So we would observe very different implications for the short term, like an immediate impacts, when the possibility of switching to another source of import and are limited, and in the longer term, when there would be a better possibility of increasing imports from other sources and ramping up the domestic supply. Next, please. So in this presentation, we explore both of these kind of time frames, and we apply a state-of-the-art global economic modeling framework where we take into account all the substitution possibilities and intersectoral linkages. So we try to represent kind of how this shock can realistically penetrate across the economy, taking into account the price impacts and how it would impact consumption and production, intermediate use. And we look into 3 scenarios where we cut their energy imports from Russia by 70, 80, and 90%. And we call these scenarios substantial, high, and severe kind of scenarios, respectively. So first, on the overall global picture, our results suggest that at the aggregate EU level, such import restrictions could lead to an increase in energy prices anywhere between 7 and 10%. And prices of transportation, like mostly public transportation, by around 4-5%. And this would translate to the reduction in their annual real income growth rate of approximately 0.4-1.1%. So, for instance, if the projection of the income growth rate is 3%, this move would reduce the growth rate to, let's say, 2%. So it doesn't mean an actual decline, but just a reduction in growth rate. Next, please. So these impacts would vary largely across countries and households. And as I mentioned, we found that Eastern European and Baltic member states are not only more dependent on energy imports from Russia, but their households also spend on average a higher share of their budget on energy and transportation. So at least 10%. And on this slide, you can see the listing of the top countries with the highest kind of expenditure shares. And consumers in these countries could be more vulnerable to this particular move of restricting energy imports. So we took into account the shares of household expenditures and focused on our kind of high scenario, which is a central one with 80% reduction in energy imports. And this scenario translates into the consumer price increases on average for EU around 0.6%, so less than 1% increase in consumer price index. Some countries like Estonia, Hungary, Czech Republic would experience a consumer price index decrease closer to 1%, 0.8%. And we found that Bulgaria is particularly could be particularly impacted by this move, considering its household consumption structure. But again, consumer price index would rise a little bit over 1%, 1.1% in the case of Bulgaria. So we then zoomed into the case of Bulgaria as potentially the most impacted country. So again, kind of representing the most kind of severe case of potential impacts. And we looked into the distributional impacts for this country. We should take into account that since lower income households, as mentioned in the case of Germany, also spend more on energy, in the case of Bulgaria, around 14% for the lowest kind of decile, so the 10% of poorest households spent around 14% on energy, while the 10% of the kind of richest household spent around 9% on energy. So when we take that into account, we find some heterogeneity in price increases across different household types. But again, it's 1.3% for the poorest, 10%, and around 1% for the richest. So this is the level of impact that we can expect. At the same time, it should be noted that these price increases are nowhere near historical variations in energy prices. So for instance, when we compare energy prices in 2011, which was a year with very high oil prices, and 2021 energy prices, in 2011 energy prices were 57% higher than in 2021. So, and even in that year, the total household expenditure on energy in Bulgaria did not exceed 12.5%. Next, please. So now we move into the longer term implications, because those would be very different from the short term implications. In the long run, EU economy would be able to kind of adapt better to this shock with increasing imports and domestic supply. And when we look into these longer term implications, what we see is that the magnitude of adverse impacts is much lower. So by 2030, so we focus on up to 2030. By 2030, the cumulative reduction in real income is only 0.4% from a relatively strict reduction in imports. So when we convert it into the annual average growth rate reduction, it's like 0.05%. So it's really a very small number. That's if we take into account these longer term implications. At the same time, we find very substantial environmental co-benefits from this move. So the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 is 6.6% relative to our reference case. We also find reductions in other air pollutants, which have a tremendous impact on premature deaths. So this would also benefit their health implications. And we also find that major restrictions on energy imports could play an important role in achieving the EU Green Deal mitigation goals. So in our reference case, CO2 emissions reduced by 48.5% in 2030 relative to 1990. And the ban on energy imports would further move this reduction to 52%. Yeah, so for the EU Green Deal, we need a 55% reduction in emissions relative to 1990, and the ban on energy imports from Russia allows to go the halfway to the EU Green Deal relative to reference scenario. We also find that this emission reduction from ban is equivalent to €40 carbon price. So this could potentially reduce the carbon price within the EU ETS by around €40, just this ban. Next, please. So before concluding, we also looked into what is at stake for the Russian economy. So would these major restrictions in energy imports from Russia be enough to impact the country's decision-making process? And our estimates suggest that, well, it should be, because such bans would come at a tremendous cost for Russian economy. So even considering the potential of relocation of Russian exports of fossil fuels in the long run, we find that the adverse impacts for Russia are 10 times those for EU, yeah, in relative terms, in terms of real income and exports. So the immediate reduction in real income would be around 6% relative to baseline, and then it would increase to 8% by 2030. Our estimates also suggest that, cumulatively by 2030, real income in Russia would reduce by €1 trillion, and export revenues, lost export revenues, would be around €1.1 trillion. Next, please. So to conclude, the reliance of Russian economy on fossil fuel export is tremendous. So this move by EU has really high potential to impact the decision making in the country. Even with 70% cut in energy imports from Russia, EU would achieve a number of goals, including a major cut in Russian export revenues flows, and B, the impacts for EU under this 70% reduction would be relatively moderate, yeah, and in par from what previous speakers have already discussed. So the real income reduction by less than 1%, energy prices increase between 7 and 8%. And this could also allow to overcome some technical constraints that, in particular for natural gas, that have been discussed and also mentioned in some other studies. But even at a higher level of restrictions, the economic outcomes are very manageable for EU, even including when we focus on the kind of countries with the lowest income, like Bulgaria, and in the poorest households, yeah, the poorest 10%. So again, as mentioned, additional policy efforts might be needed to protect the most vulnerable from this particular outcome. And the last but not least, in the longer run, we find substantial environmental co-benefits. Yeah, so it would reduce EU ETS carbon price substantially by around €40, also achieve reductions in CO2 emissions and air pollutants. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm trying to get Oleg Ustenko on the line.